Yeah, so those are just a couple aspects of the significance of being conceived by the Holy Spirit and why that was necessary and why it's the core part of what we believe. Now I want to move on to another subject, and if I can, just to bridge the gap, I'm going to let you take the reins on this one. But I would say
Yeah,
I had a conversation with a pastor a while back about this topic, and I said, I feel like Protestant churches tend to throw the baby out with the bathwater in in several places in our theology when it comes to theology that we've inherited from Catholic Orthodoxy. If it's okay if I use that phrase. Uh, and I think the disregard for the Virgin Mary is a really good example of one of the things that gets thrown out, that Protestant churches really do not spend much time thinking of, even to the point where it's very frequently misunderstood. So that's all I'm going to say as a lead in, because next we're going to talk about the Virgin Mary. So, Britt, I'll let you take that away.
So the reason Ben is giving this to me is that I have a strong passion for the virgin birth. Um, Let me give you a reason, some context why. You're probably wondering who cares and why. Let me tell you who cares. Early church heretics and the apostles that created this creed. We talked a little bit about the heresies that were going on in Gnosticism, right?
Mhm.
And you'll even hear some of this stuff today in different forms. One of them is actually the Mormon Church, and their interpretation of Jesus has Gnostic roots in it, and the way that they describe him is not the same way that Christians do. They'll use the same language, but they'll mean different things. So be wary of that. If you have Mormon friends, I'm not telling you that they're terrible people. But what I am saying is that it's probably not fair to call them explicitly Christian in the same way an Orthodox Christian is.
Mhm.
And I feel very confident and comfortable saying that. As much as I don't like to like isolate and attack people, I just want to make that clear. So the reason it's a big deal is this: what was going on is the Gnostics really wanted to have that like pseudo gospel we talked about with like Marcion and those guys, right? So what they would do is they reinterpret the way Jesus' birth happened. Like, oh, Mary was his adopted mom. He can't be born of flesh because remember, flesh is bad, spirit is good. So if he was actually physically born, what does that mean? He had to have a physical body.
Mhm.
Like even the craziness back then, Marcion's not going to debate that when a mom has a baby, the baby is a human being. I
Mhm.
didn't mean to cut you off, Ben. Did you have something you want to chime in there with?
Nope.
Oh,
Keep
yeah.
going.
So it's a big deal, right? Like they're not going to deny that. So this is a real claim. This is the stake that is like really really important. So we've talked about incarnation. The creed is addressing people that didn't have a problem with Jesus as God. They had a problem with Jesus as man. So we've talked a lot about like him bridging the gap. I really want to stress how important it is to understand Jesus as a human being. Now, you can't only understand him as a human being. That's a different kind of heresy that we can go into maybe another day, right? But you got
Yep.
to understand him as both human being and God, right? As a human being, unlike God, he feels things and he deals in not knowing. Like God can see all things simultaneously, right? Like the God the Father can see beginning, middle, and end, right, of a story. Like he exists in a different way outside of time. His relationship to the planet Earth and to time and to people is fundamentally different than ours is to each other or to time and space. That's really technical. Jesus is like us, but he's blameless in the sense that he is the only human being that could ever live to God's moral perfection, right? So in the Gospels, especially in Mark, you'll see like the messianic secret where he doesn't want to tell like that he's God, and then there's even debates among scholars and academics. And I highlight this not to get into it, but to prove my point that Jesus, couldn't know how he was going to die. Like he didn't know the future. He wasn't omniscient, though he is God. It gets a little complex there, right? But the point is that he didn't enter human skin, that he was fully man, like he was who he was, and he walked around. So the virgin birth is a really, really big point because it nails that in and it allows our early church to look at these Gnostics who are talking about flesh being bad and allows them to say, no, no, he is still fully God, but he was fully God as man, and he's fully man, and he's just like you and I. So we talked a lot about flesh not being bad, right? Because it's not. God gave you
Mhm.
this body that you live in right now. The ears you're using to listen to this podcast, some of you who haven't tuned this out, the brain that you're processing this with, right? If you're on the YouTube channel, the eyes that you're watching with, All those things gifts from God. All those things are part of his divine order and structure. And this virgin birth is symbolic in two ways. One, it makes Jesus man, which is critical to the way we need to understand him. And two, it allows us to really get at to the heart of like really what we need to address as a church, I think. And you're right, we do throw the baby out with the bathwater. We don't talk about this enough. That he was man. We want to talk about him as savior, and that's great. We need to talk about him as savior, but we also need to talk about him as human because he allows us to understand ourselves better and how we ought to be. Does that make sense?
Mhm.
Okay.
Yeah,
I feel like I've been on a ranty mood today, and I just want to make sure that my rants are making coherent, actual sentences. So,
it's fine.
yeah. So, is it okay if I use that to kind of transition to the quote? Because I really like your quote, Ben.
Yeah, yeah, that's fine. Go for it.
Yeah. I didn't know if you have anything in there that you wanted to squeeze in because I kind of went for a long time. But
Uh,
go ahead.
no, yeah. So I had a quote here that I pulled from a book I was reading called "Christian Doctrine of the Old Testament," and I did not realize at the time that it was written by a Catholic, but I learned really fast. The heavy use of Latin, kind of gave it away. But part of the purpose of this book was to try and explain um, from Protestant perspectives some of these things that the Protestant Church has either dropped or just sort of disregards or has forgotten about. But he's still communicating like, no, like these are valuable things that help us better understand who we are, who God is, and His character. So he there's a quote in this book, and I'll just say this before you read it. Um, I put in brackets just to help explain, but he's drawing a correlation between the temple in the Old Testament and the Virgin Mary in the New Testament. So in the Old Testament, um, the temple was where the presence of God was, like specifically the Holy of Holies. And the temple was considered an incredibly sacred and holy place because the presence of God dwelled there. So he's just sort of drawing off of that. So that's all I'm going to say. So I'll pass it back over to you to read the quote.
Before I read the quote, this is just a dumb story. It made me laugh, and I just was curious. Do you remember? Did you watch The Office, Ben? Did you ever watch The Office?
Oh yes, yep,
Okay. So there's an episode where Michael, for a birthday party, hires a woman with a unique job, and you know how Michael is. He's super awkward, and
yep,
before she jumps out of the birthday cake and she's trying to figure this out, like she walks in, he's like, "We're not worthy," and just like ruins it for everybody. And I get that. I laugh because sometimes I hear about the Old Testament, and because I've watched way too much Office in my life, and I think about like how you had to like someone was selected and it was like by the hand of God they go to the holiest of holies, right? And I just keep
hmm
thinking of everybody else on the outside like we're not worthy. I just think of 100 Michael Scotts in the temple, and that's so bad. And that's so demeaning to the Jewish like tradition. It's not what I mean, but the idea of like that like self abasement and like the
hmm
humbleness, and not in an unhealthy way like Michael's is, but it just makes
yeah,
me think of that. So I don't know. Maybe I just added some levity. Maybe I just totally threw it off. But let's read this quote um, before you realize I'm not worthy. So, according to the logic of the incarnation, that is God entering into, excuse me, and inhabiting physical space vis-a-vis the temple in the Old Testament. The moment of Mary's conception is transformational. Her body remains holy forever thereafter because it has housed the Holy One of Israel, and as the temple could be revered and praised on its own terms without any worry of committing some form of idolatrous apostasy. So Mary could be revered and adored. Gary Anderson.
yeah. So obviously we've transitioned a little bit into a topic that I'm sure has a lot of people just sort of like, what on earth are they talking about now? Because so I was at a breakfast once with a group of guys. They're all from different churches, and one of them was just going off the rails about something. I mean, every week someone's going off the rails about something, but he was going off the rails about Mary um, in the Catholic Church. And he says, like, I just don't get it. I don't get how they can call themselves Christian when they idolize Mary. Like Mary is an idol. Like they worship her. Um, and
Misinterpretation, but okay.
Yeah, no, I mean that's exactly right though. And I just remember listening to that because that is a very common idea. Like I want to be sensitive to that. that from the outside looking in, which is weird that a Christian church could see the veneration of Mary as like something that we're witnessing from the outside. Um, but again, this is something I feel like is thrown out, like the baby with the bathwater again, is the significance of the Virgin Mary and the fact that there's a good reason why, for most of church history, even up until now, except for some, Christians, Protestants in particular, she has been so heavily venerated and respected, not worshipped. Like no one has ever believed that she was uh, like on the same level as God or anything. But there is a certain special veneration that is okay with who Mary is, and her place in the church. Even Revelation uses imagery that, I mean, scholars agree, like, yeah, the imagery used here is referring to the Virgin Mary.
Hmm.
So even the New Testament puts her at a very special place, and it's not unheard of. Like the quote Jordan just read, it's the same thing as when Moses is on the mount and he's talking with God. Like the mountain itself sort of became a very holy place to the point where people couldn't even touch it, or else they were going to die. The same thing with the tabernacle and the temple. Like these became sacred, holy places, but the the respect that they were showed and the reverence they were showed was never considered idolatry. It was never considered as like, oh, this is just tabernacle worship, or this is just worship of the temple. That's not how it was seen. It was a special significance those places had because the presence of God dwelled there.
Mhm.
So, what should it say to us then that the presence of God literally inhabited Mary's womb? So, I don't think this uh, reverence and respect that showed to Mary is, I don't think it's illogical at all. I think it makes total sense. And I think there's a lot that we could gain from that.
No, I agree. I think it's really good. And like I said, I'm a vehement defender of the virgin birth and specifically of the Virgin Mary by extension, right?
Mhm.
But no, what you're saying is powerful. We're revering her as a figure, and that's probably part of the intention of the creed to a lesser extent, right? Because would have to slander Mary in those times in order to prove their point that Jesus is God, right? Is like a lie.
Yeah,
Whereas they venerate and honor her in a different way. That's really powerful. I'm glad you put that quote in.
yeah, me too. And certainly we could talk more about it, though I'm not prepared to really go like to dive the depths of this conversation. I guess I'll just say this is just a seed that maybe we could plant.
Hmm.
Is that this is certainly a conversation that is worth exploring. I think there's a lot of value to be found here, um, in Mary's connection with the church and the role that she has
Yeah,
in the church.
yeah.
Um, yeah, I
No,
guess
it's
this.
powerful. I wish
Yeah,
she got
this
mentioned more than just on Christmas, around Christmas and Advent. I think that
yeah,
there's some value there of understanding like God's working with people and like how Mary is key to like the salvific plan of God in the universe.
yeah. Now, obviously, the Immaculate Conception of Mary herself, I think, is a separate conversation that we could have.
Yeah.
That she herself was conceived immaculately, which um, certainly a lot of people have issue with. I think that one, though, I think there's a better case to be made for having issue with that one. But I don't know enough about that to really dive into it.
Yeah,
Um,
that one I feel like is like one of those things that like gets brought up as like important, but I feel like it's more of a fringe movement that people are just
yeah,
afraid of. Do you mind if I circle back to one thing in
go
relation to
for
kind of tie a bow on this?
it. Hmm.
I talked at length, and I hope I didn't sound like I was attacking any Mormons. I live in an area where Mormons are pretty dense because I'm next to Utah in Colorado, um, and I have some friends that are Mormon too. I have no beef with the Church of Mormon outside of them calling themselves Christian and Franklin Graham telling us that Mormons are Christians, so we would vote for Mitt Romney back when he faced Obama and like the elections. That's the only time I've ever really had beef with the Mormon Church because I was like, that's really dumb. But that's more my beef with Franklin Graham and by extension with them. So they're innocent bystanders.
Fair
Anyway,
enough.
sorry if that got political. Just it's the truth though. That's the only time I've ever had a problem with Mormons. But what I was trying to get at, when I talk about the virgin birth, I want it to be something that you hold on to and understand. Like when we talk about this creed, like this is the root of faith. Like you want to hold on to it tightly because if you don't, you can easily and subtly, right, or subtly, I don't know how you say that word actually. I think the B is silent, subtly, get swept away by different like pseudo, I'll call them perversions or slight twists or tweaks in the faith, right? You know, one of the things that I'll probably combat, and this is a high horse I get on a lot, is the Platonism of the church in the language we use. Platonism is kind of the root of a lot of the left behind stuff. So if you're someone who's really into like the rapture or dispensationalism, if you know that term, and you're on the listen to this podcast, uh, I respect you and I care for you deeply as a brother in Christ. But you and I probably don't agree on this at all. And I say that to say this, that like I want to combat that kind of thinking that this world is beyond redemption and we need to get ejected out. And so when the more that they tie Jesus to being man, and the more that we understand that flesh and reality in this world and being part of it is good, the more that we understand God's plan for our lives and God's plan for the world. And there is a reason, there is a real reason that God became flesh, and it's part of that narrative. Not only that he could be both the offender, right, man who went against God's will, but the offended, but also because part of that is that he had to indwell in the actual nature and creation itself, what is moving away from God with that gap, right, on its own.
Mhm.
This is him inhabiting that earth and that planet. You know, the reality is that if God wanted to, he could have done like, hey, who got closest instead of hitting 100% of my laws, who got like 80 and done this like lifeboat evacuation. And, you know, you just kind of don't drink or chew or go with girls that do your way into heaven. Right. Like,
Mhm.
and it's playful, but he didn't do it that way. That's not how this works. That's not what he wanted for us. And that's why I'm such a vehement defender. So I know this line's kind of seems silly and it's easy to overlook. And I know that we've kind of talked at length a lot more about virgin birth than you probably care to think about. But there's a reason, and that's my reason. That's why I defend that. Because I think it's important that we really think in those terms, because that's the way the early church thought. And that's the way that we need to think.
Mhm.
Sorry.
No, that's I
Maybe.
really like how you put that. Yeah. I mean, it just blows my mind though too. Like the idea that God actually became a part of the material world, I think just elevates the value of it that much more. Like it's not like God was just here for like a portion of time. Like
Yeah.
when Christ was resurrected, the tomb was empty.
Yeah.
Like his physical material body did not like just disappear. Like it rose again. Which this is something I'm still trying to process my way through. So Jordan, you can set me straight if you have an answer on this.
Maybe.
But the fact that in Jesus's ascension, um, his body was not, I guess, left behind.
No,
Um,
it
that
wasn't.
God so took on the incarnation, and it is so significant, and this material, physical world is so significant that he became uh, an eternal part of it. Like we know God is spirit, right? We know that, but God took on a physical, material existence in the incarnation. Um, and that itself, like again, I'm still trying to process that. Like Jesus ascended, so does God still exist in a physical, material way? And
So
will he forever? I know, like that's a tangent, but
no, it's not tangent. It's relevant. I'll give you my short answer, and this is going to be again a bad. I just feel like I've misquoted a billion people today that are way smarter and better at their job than I am. But I recently read "Surprised by Hope" by N.T. Wright,
hmm,
which if you haven't read it and you're a young Christian, it's dense because it's going to make you think a lot and rethink a lot about the way you go about establishing theology. Now, if you've been to Bible college, you may have been introduced to this, and you're going to have a view one way or the other. He tends to be pretty divisive in that sense. He doesn't leave a lot of room for himself to like be embraced by all, which is probably why I think there's a little more truth to it than other things. I get skeptical of things that are like hardly rejecting everything and are like so specific that only could be this way, compared to things that are like more open and that everybody can believe. I think
hmm,
generally the truth lies somewhere in the middle, right? Because truth always has a cost of some form, but it doesn't mean that it can't be believed by other. Anyway, that's not even there.
hmm,
But N.T. Wright's his he talks about the ascension, and if I understood him correctly in his interpretation of the Gospels, because he is a Greek scholar,
Mhm.
Jesus physically did ascend into heaven, which means wherever heaven is, and I don't know the Greek well enough, and I don't remember it well enough because I read this 3 weeks ago to tell you exactly how he interprets that. Wherever that place is, he is physically and literally there. And that is the place, the heavens, right? Where he is going to bring, and that's going to like join and invade and be part of the redemption plan of Earth. Like Earth is not going to be sucked up; it's going to be redeemed and shifted. Like it's the David Crowder song, "Heaven meets Earth with your whichever type of kiss you prefer." I don't even remember. I don't want to get into the debate. Whatever version you prefer, unforeseen, sloppy, wet. Who cares? When it comes back and does that, right? That's when Jesus will return. But he is physically up in the heavens, and right like me, and this is why I defend that because I believe what Wright's saying is really strong on that point. Like you can't be a Christian and not accept the body, which means when you read the ascension, that literally happened, which means he literally went up to heaven in a body.
Mhm.
And you're not gonna do that. That's not how that's gonna work. He's gonna come back and you'll be resurrected as a body and you will have a perfect body like him. It's gonna be similar but different, right? It's going to be recognizable. Like they could recognize Jesus after a while, but it took them a while, right? People would walk by Jesus and they didn't recognize him, you know? And then even Thomas had trouble realizing, he's like, well, if you're Jesus, let me see your hands. And he has to like physically prove to Thomas,
Mhm.
the doubting disciple, who's still a disciple, mind you, for having
Yeah.
doubts and wanting to know um,
Yeah.
about that.
But which I think is significant that Jesus actually indulges that. I think we give Thomas
I think it's a
a
bad
lot
rap.
of
It's
yeah.
probably
I
a
think
good
we
guy.
give him a lot of flack. Yeah, like who doesn't ask that? Like if I were in that situation, I'd probably do the same thing. Like Jesus, we saw you die. Like you were dead.
Yeah. And
Like
keep in
how do
mind
we?
that he'd only been following this dude for 3 years, and like everything Jesus said, he understood as like a Jewish man. Like you were
Yeah,
going to win the war, not die. That's not how this is supposed to. Like however many years old he was, like before these last three we were together,
yeah,
you were supposed to win, and then you didn't. So forgive me if I'm a little skeptical when you're coming back and be like, "Nah, dude, it's good," you know?
yeah. But Jesus could have said, you know what? Just stop doubting and believe, which he does say. But in between there, he says, all right, if you want proof, here's the proof. Like put your hand or put your finger on my hand, put your hand in my side, like there it is. Which I think we tend to glance over that pretty quick, the fact that yeah, Thomas did doubt, but Jesus indulged his questions.
Yeah,
He didn't just disregard it. He like Jesus recognized, no, like you legitimately are concerned whether or not like I am who I say I am,
yeah.
so I'm going to prove that to you. um Anyways.
One last quick tangent because I have to actually get going here. Please
Yeah.
cut that out of the podcast. One last quick tangent though. Um, I believe that good arguments for the faith and apologetics get us very, very close to God, but they can't get us to the Trinity and to the person of Jesus Christ, and they can't get us directly to believe that He is who He says He is. Like that requires a leap of faith, and I think that's what's happening in this passage, or at least it's how I've interpreted the passage for myself. Maybe that's a bad interpretation. I don't know.
No,
The
I
narrative,
don't think
though, I
so.
think supports that structure, right?
Yeah.
That, like he indulges, like, no, like here is the evidence. Now, at some point, you can still doubt me, right? But you
Mhm.
have to take that leap. You have to choose to do that. Kierkegaard calls it a leap of faith, and I think a lot of times, especially post for us Protestants, because we're so like sola fide is a big belief for us, solely by faith alone, right? That's Martin Luther, sticking it to the Catholics back in the day, and honestly, truthfully, rightfully so. At that point in time, with the corruption in the church, and early on in his movement, he didn't want to split anyway. But the point was that it was faith alone that did that. But I think we've taken that and we've interpreted it the wrong way, or we've taken it to its extreme, that we've kind of been like, okay, faith alone is good. Like that's all you need to believe. You can believe off not having a lot of evidence, like some of the early disciples did. But it's okay if you need a little more. Like that doesn't
Mhm.
make you any less of a Christian. In fact, Peter kind of becomes a great apologist in his books, right? And he even gives like First Peter or Second Peter 4:13. Is it first or second the apology for faith?
uh that one I'm not sure.
Now I've crossed myself up. One of the books of Peter 4:13 is like the big apologetics first, and now I've tongue tied myself into a rabbit hole. But I know we've hammered this point home, but I really want to stress that like there's some things that require a level of attention, even if they seem small and petty. And to some extent, we've probably made our point a little too much. But on the other hand, maybe think about that. It leads to bigger places, and that there's an interconnectedness and a web here that we're
Mhm.
trying to remain intact. So sometimes we have to fight hard on stuff that doesn't seem important. Well, theologians do.